Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Hi, everyone. Today, I have an extra special treat. Two fabulous people who help writers get unstuck. My guests today are Cathy Fyock, a business book strategist and writer of the recent book, Writer Crisis Hotline, and Cathy Kirch, adjunct professor of writing at Columbia University and founder of the ADHD Writers Guild. Today, we'll be talking about how to move forward with your writing projects. Welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So I'll start with you, Cathy Fyock. Just tell us really quickly your story of how you got to be someone who helps writers move forward with their projects.
Well, when I started working as a consultant and speaker, I found that writing was the number one strategy to help me stand out in the crowd, differentiate myself from everybody else who is doing consulting and speaking, and really step into thought leadership. So it's been a really important role for me, yet it has never been easy for me. So I had the opportunity through just being invited to help some folks with their writing projects. And in doing so, I thought, I could do this for a living. I could become a book coach. So I am so passionate about helping individuals step into their thought leadership and up-level their business, their platform, their ministry, whatever it might be. So I'm very excited about the work that I do.
Great. Thank you. And Cathy Kirch, tell us a little of your story.
Well, I was in my MFA program, working on my MFA in fiction when I started teaching writing as a graduate student, and then moved on in an adjunct capacity, still teaching at Columbia, still where I started, and I love the community there. And then I was diagnosed ADHD, and that kind of put a new perspective on a lot of things. So I started to realize both why I wrote the way I did and why certain writers who continued to request working with me over and over again liked working with me so much. And I realized that the strategies that I use and the strategies that I teach are specifically sort of targeting, even though I initially didn't realize that they were, really targeting a sort of neurodivergent brain and alternative way of thinking, alternative way of writing. And so from there, just kind of poured everything into that, as ADHDers are wont to do, dove really, really deep. I thought for sure there has to be some research on how ADHD folks write, and discovered that the research is actually pretty lacking. And so I began doing my own research, running my own empirical studies, and I also launched the ADHD Writers Guild, a specific community dedicated to by and for ADHD writers to help neurodivergent brains get unstuck in the writing process.
Thank you. So, Cathy Fyock, back to you. Talk a little bit about what you see as blocks to getting your writing projects going, and what are the ways in which you really help writers?
Most of the writers that I work with are not writers first. They don't have a natural love of writing. They were never drawn to writing. No one ever told them, oh, you're a great writer, for the most part. Most of my folks are consultants, coaches who are experts in their field, so they may not feel like they have an expertise in writing. So I give them the confidence to know that they can do it and get them unstuck. Many times it's several issues that I see over and over and over again, and everybody thinks they're totally unique. But most of the writers I work with face the fear of being exposed. So there's a certain fear in writing. So helping folks overcome that. There's this notion that I'm super busy. Most all of my clients are super busy professionals, successful professionals who don't really have time to write. So we figure out how to create the time opportunity and help them see that it is possible to write even when you only have short chunks of time. And then just the confidence to know how you stare down a blank page and how you get away from that whole stigma of looking at this daunting blank page and thinking, how do I even begin? So helping people create that strategy plan.
Yeah. And Cathy Kirch, talk a little bit about the research that you've done into the discovery process around ADHD and how to handle that and how to become a more, accomplished writer or effective writer, or again, getting unstuck.
Yeah.
for those neurodivergent folk.
So the interesting thing about writing research kind of up to this point is that it's really focused on, so there's a kind of unstated assumption in writing studies research. And that unstated assumption is that the neurotypical brain is the default, that the sort of research that has been done on writers and writing process generally sort of assumes a neurotypical experience. But we also know that a significant portion of writers, and in the context of my work at Columbia, college students, significant portion are neurodivergent, and even more than that, many are neurodivergent and don't even know it, and have been undiagnosed.
Do you know anyone like that?
Gee. And so worth also noting that those most affected by underdiagnosis tend to be already in marginalized communities and identities, writers of color, women, and non-binary folks, and those socialized as female, as well as folks from lower income families tend to be underdiagnosed and tend to not even have that, not even know that they are neurodivergent, but also not even getting that support in school. And so part of the goals of my research is not just to understand the neurodivergent brain and how the neurodivergent writer works, but to also shift the narrative in a couple of ways. Shifting it, one, to view neurodivergence not as deficit but as difference, in the same way that a car with an automatic transmission and a car with a manual transmission both get you where you want to go. But if you try to drive a manual transmission car like you would an automatic transmission, you're probably going to stall out. And so the other sort of goal that I have is that by understanding the neural networks and the neural circuitry at work in the neurodivergent brain, we can better help all writers of all neurotypes, because everybody has a brain, and no one's brain is running at 100% of the time. And so the goal being to really sort of write with the brain we have now, not an imagined ideal of a brain that we assume as a default.
My favorite analogy to this would be what we have in physics is consider the spherical horse.
Right.
that you make some assumption about what is typical, and you build all your models around that, and it doesn't actually fit anyone, not
Right.
perfectly, right? But on the other hand, you have to start someplace.
You do. And I think that I think that, the research is now to a point where we've looked at the spherical horse. And there's still some gaps that we haven't quite figured out. And so I think that those can be, we can look at the non-spherical horses and understand how those brains work. And in terms of the things that I see sort of folks of all neurotypes getting stuck, there's a lot around executive dysfunction and the ability to sort of control where our attention goes, and our ability to sort of start and switch tasks, as well as challenges around managing working memory. Everybody has a working memory. Everybody's working memory has limited capacity. Some of our working memories have more limited capacity than others. And in fact, a lot of strategies that any writer uses oftentimes is centered around managing the burdens that writing places on.
That sort of brings me back to what Cathy Fyock, what you said about the staring at the blank page, and so I'd love to have I'd love to sort of start a conversation here between you about how do you talk to people who are stuck either because they're overwhelmed with the project, or they're overwhelmed with other thoughts, or how do we help them?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I know I really work with on all my clients is we always start with a strategy session. And in the strategy session, we map out the strategic elements of the book, especially as it aligns with their business or their ministry or platform. So we talk about the purpose of the book and how it's going to be used. We define the thesis statement, and you wouldn't believe how hard that is sometimes to get people to articulate in a sentence or two what their book is about, who their targeted reader is, and then what kind of structural outline. Because what I've found is that if people don't have that as a starting point, they can be all over the place because they're thinking, what do I know on this topic? Which a lot of times is quite a lot of information. So how do you sort through that? Well, it's not about all that you know, and it's really focusing on what your reader needs. What is the problem that you're trying to solve for that reader? And how can you craft pieces of advice that would be helpful for that reader? But Cathy, I'm curious to know what you have to say around that.
Yeah. I was so intrigued by what you were saying about the sort of setting things up at the beginning of the process, that I've forgotten what the initial question was. ADHD at work. What was the initial question?
So how do we get unstuck? How do we get people who are staring at that blank page and just...
Well, I think that I'm so sorry. I think my feed is cutting out a little bit, so I'm sorry if I jumped in the middle. But I guess the sort of nature of the stuckness, I think, is one of those questions that can be useful to answer in terms of figuring out how to get unstuck. So I think there are a lot of times we think of just one kind of writer's block, right? The writer isn't writing, but the sort of sources of those blocks can be different, and so the remedies for those blocks can shift as well. And so I think in terms of kind of getting unstuck, sort of starting by interrogating the stuckness, figuring out what exactly is it that is getting me stuck? Is it because I don't know what to do moving forward? Or is it because I know what to do, but for some reason I'm not able to sort of press the gas and go, right? If we use that sort of car analogy, I'm sitting in a manual transmission and I'm pressing the gas and it's not moving forward. What the heck do I do? And so I think
might be in neutral.
Yeah. Right. It's you're in neutral, you're going uphill. What's going on here? And so I think Yeah, so I think sort of starting by interrogating, what is the thing why am I stuck? And then sort of building strategies and pulling tools from the toolbox around that.
Mhm.
I think a huge source of stuckness that I mentioned previously is that sort of the limitations of working memory, right? The writing is, and the research actually shows us this, writing is cognitively the most difficult activity that the adult brain engages in. Just it's the most cognitively demanding. It's the most sort of difficult for our brain, and part of that is the burden that it places on working memory, that in order to write, we have to hold what we wanna say, how we wanna say it, and how a reader might interpret it all at the same time. And we're also, again, sort of spherical horse, no one's coming to the writing page with just those things. We have a million other things going on that are taking our attention and kind of demanding space in our working memory. And so one of the things that I know helps me sort of clear out some of the excess is doing a bit of a brain dump before I start writing, and just sort of brain dumping on the page, usually writing longhand, just
Mhm.
getting everything else out. All of the things that are kind of swimming around in my head, writing, just setting a timer for 5 minutes or writing out like a full page or however, I want to sort of set parameters on that. So of course that could go forever, but setting a timer or some sort of constriction of like, okay, I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to dump everything that is in my brain. And usually it's like, okay, I have this appointment later, or oh, I need to go to run this errand, or oh, this person's waiting for a reply from me, or, all of the other sort of things of the things that I have to do. And sometimes it's ideas around the project, and sometimes it's completely separate things and issues. But I find that's sort of that's just one way that I find, at least like sitting down at the beginning of a writing session when I'm feeling like, okay, I'm like ready to go, and I have the page open, and sometimes even getting to that point is hard, but the page is open and I'm looking at it, and there's just so much stuff going on that just kind of emptying the brain a little bit, creating some space in that working memory, and then moving forward in the writing process in a way that allows you to sort of focus on one thing at a time, right? So we're not
Mhm.
trying to make ourselves we're not trying to make ourselves edit at the same time that we're structuring, right? Which
Right.
is, Cathy F, what you were saying about sort of creating that structure beforehand. What that sort of allows your writers to do is then uh, they're able to sort of think about what the structure is separately from the actual generation of the text. And so then that sort of what that does is sort of separate those processes so that
Mhm.
the brain doesn't have to be thinking about structure while it's generating, and it doesn't have to be
Right.
generating while it's thinking about structure. And I think that goes for writers, whether you outline before or whether you sort of write more stream of consciousness and then sort of move things into place, that the sort of being able to kind of separate those processes and allow the brain to have the space in the working memory to just be doing one thing, is something that's really useful in terms of reducing that burden on working memory.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Cathy.
I was just going to say one of the things I do too to get people, um, writing a book is overwhelming. It's a huge, huge, huge task. And so dividing it into little chunks is so helpful. So you're not having to think about the whole thing. So getting the structure right is one thing. And then the other thing is to create a list of questions that you want to answer, and then answering one question at a time. So a lot of times what I'll do with my authors is we'll map out all the questions that the reader will want to have answered by the end of the book, organize that list of questions, and then just as you write, you're answering a question, which is easier than writing a book. So getting very focused about what the task is, very, very focused. And the timer is incredibly important as well.
Um, so Cathy Fyock, when I was listening to Cathy Kirch talk about, emptying the brain, and I'm wondering if maybe some of your entrepreneurs and your consultants who are overwhelmed with how much they have to do might benefit from writing down all of that stuff that they have that they're not going to worry about while they're writing. Because even for, I'll say, neurotypical folk, I don't know very many of them, but that sort of, I'm overwhelmed with all that I have to do, can be a huge burden. And I would think that an exercise like Cathy suggested, with writing it all down.
Absolutely. List making is a wonderful strategy for allowing and I'm not a brain science person, but unloading that prefrontal cortex with all of those, I got to do this, I got to do that, putting it on a list, and then working on a task at hand that allows you to really free up that space and get singularly focused. So I love I'm a list maker myself.
Yeah.
I also love a good list, and I also I love a good pen for a good list. That's one of the things that gives me a lot of dopamine, is being able to use my extensive colorful pen collection to write those lists. And I think the what that kind of does for me is it gives me that sort of boost of dopamine in the beginning. I think something that's sort of interesting about the some of the challenges here around, like some of the things that we're saying are kind of like, do one thing at a time, which I'm sure for anyone, an ADHD listener would be like, oh yeah, great. Like all my problems are solved. And so I want to clarify that I think what we're not saying, or at least what I'm not saying, is that you need to have a singular focus and be really rigid about what you're doing at any given point. I know for me, if I'm too rigid with myself, my sort of inner teenager comes out and is like, well, now I'm not gonna do that. And so I think having that kind of flexibility is important. I think that what's important to note here is that, I'm not necessarily saying that, okay, you have to be really, really strict with yourself and you're only doing one thing at a time. And you have to have that singular focus and don't get distracted and all of those things, but rather to, that you're setting things up so that your brain, the working memory is sort of only focused on one particular task. And that doesn't necessarily mean don't get distracted, because distractions are going to happen. They're going to happen for anyone. But one of the things that we can do when those distractions come up, for example, is to have a place to put them. Right. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm writing is I have a distraction pad, which is a piece of paper that's right next to me, so that when I'm working on something and something else pops up, I can write it down so that my working memory doesn't need to worry about holding on to it. And then I can kind of keep going. Similarly, that we can, with the goal of sort of allowing our brains to do one thing at a time, that thing can still switch rapidly. We can still sort of switch modes if we decide to. But I think so for anybody who's listening and going like, well, I don't have a singular focus and I can't focus on one thing for a long time, except sometimes when I'm in deep and hyper focus, and then like I forget to go to the bathroom. But the sort of but sort of thinking about not necessarily the sort of rigidity of trying to get ourselves to focus on one thing, but the sort of flexibility that we can move with our brain and let our brain kind of go where it needs to, while also being cognizant of, not trying to make it do something else. Because I think the sort of, if we're trying to force ourselves to do one thing and then we have all of these other things that are kind of popping up for us, then that's taking up mental space and working memory capacity as well. So, at the same time that we want to make sure we're allowing our brains to just do one thing at a time, we're not forcing our brains to write in a certain way, right? Because the more we try to force our brains to do something a certain way, the more that those other possibilities and that sort of flexibility, the desire for flexibility, is kind of pulling on our attention and on our working memory as well. And so having that flexibility is is, just as useful in being able to attend to where our brain kind of wants to go and allowing ourselves to kind of move with that rather than fighting against it is also really important for the writing process.
So Cathy Fyock, how do you see that helping your entrepreneurs and consultants?
Well, it does a lot. And I love what Cathy said about not being overly rigid. It's important to sort of say, I'm going to work on one thing because we can't really work on two things at one time. But what I also say to my authors is once you've mapped out your whole book, you've created the structure and a great outline, then give yourself permission to move around within that space. So what I typically tell my authors is don't start with chapter one. That's typically one of the hardest chapters to write. So go ahead and write where your energy is leading you. And if your energy wanes during chapter 3, well, then go to chapter 5 or skip around, always working toward your outline and in your outline. So having that overall structure that you want to keep to, but giving yourself the flexibility to go where, oh, that would be fun, or I've got a really great inspirational idea. So I love what she said, and I totally agree that giving yourself permission to work within a framework is great strategy.
I love that. I think that the sort of permission to move around is and sort of work non-linearly is so important for any brain. I think a lot of times we have this picture of writers that they sit down and they start with chapter 1 and then they keep typing until they hit the end. And no one writes like that. In fact, there has been research on sort of writing processes, and what they found is that no one writes that way. No one just sits down and like, okay, I'm going to pre-write and then I'm going to outline, and then my outline's not going to change, and then I'm going to start with the beginning, and then I'm going to go to the end, and then I'm going to revise everything once, and then I'm going to proofread, and then it's going to be like, no one works in that sort of linear fashion.
No.
And so I know for me, I in any given project, I have so many different sites of construction that are sort of in various stages of completion. And I know that, some writers might prefer to work slightly more linearly than I do. But I think the sort of giving ourselves permission to move around does so much, both in terms of allowing ourselves to enjoy the writing process, but also in terms of, again, that sort of working memory. It's easiest, if we're drawing more on long-term memory, then we're not relying as much on short-term memory. So the sort of adage of write what you know can kind of be applied here, that if there's a spot that you feel particularly inspired to write or excited to write, or that you feel like I kind of know what the shape of this is and I have a pretty clear picture of what it is, it's a great place to begin because you don't have to rely quite as much on your short-term memory, on your working memory. The other thing that does is by sort of giving ourselves permission to write in the places that we enjoy or that we want to, or kind of, sort of listening to ourselves and going where the writing feels easiest, is we're also sort of making it easier for our executive functions to kind of start the writing process, right? So it's really, really hard to get started on a process that or a task that we don't want to do. And part of that is that if our brain perceives a task as painful, and in this case, if our brain perceives a particular writing task as painful, then it wants to protect us. And it can feel as right, starting with something that we really don't want to be writing or that we really don't want to be doing can feel as impossible as getting our hand to touch a hot stove, right? It's that same sort of protective mechanism at work, that where our brain's like, that's gonna suck. That's gonna be really painful. I'm not gonna let you do that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna protect you from that. And so giving ourselves permission to start in the places that's easiest, as well as sort of being able to find the things that we enjoy, even when we do get to the parts that are harder, and sort of trying to find the ways to make those processes and tasks less painful can give our brain that sort of, it's okay, I'm going to be all right. Thank you for trying to protect me, but I'm good and I'm going to get started now.
Yeah. I also love the jumping around idea in terms of leveraging the subconscious, because our subconscious brain, we expect, again, this is part of the whole working memory and the prefrontal cortex and understanding how the brain works, but recognizing that the computing capacity of the subconscious just dwarfs the capacity of the conscious brain. And so if your subconscious is continuing to work on some other part of the book, some other part of the writing project, and you say, oh, now I know what I want to say there, and you just sort of go, right, out it comes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I love. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things I suggest to my authors is, as they're wrapping up a writing session, to identify what they're going to do next. So identify in the outline, or it doesn't even have to be a sequential piece, but just identify what you're going to write next, and then sleep on that. But write it down. I'm going to work on this next. So when you come back to writing, not only have you had that time to process it, but you know where you're going to pick up, and you're not just staring at the blank page.
That's great.
Yeah. I love those sort of work shutdown rituals, the way that we're kind of like we're leaving breadcrumbs for our future selves, right? That it's like, I wouldn't expect, if I was collaborating with someone, I wouldn't expect them to read my mind. So like, why do we expect ourselves to read the minds of our past selves, right? How can we sort of treat ourselves with the same kind of respect that we would treat our collaborators? And, even being communicative, and even overly communicative with our future selves, so we know how to get into the project when we come back.
So that's great. Cathy Fyock, just really quickly, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you if they want to reach out?
Oh, they can visit my website or just send me an email. It's Cathy@cathyfyock.com. Great.
And Cathy Kirch, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you?
You can find me on the internet. My Instagram and probably just about every other handle is @MyWritingHero. You can also visit my website, mywritinghero.com. Or send me an email, cykirch@mywritinghero.com.
Great. And that concludes our show. Thanks to my guests, Cathy Fyock and Cathy Kirch. I hope you've learned something about how to get unstuck and move forward with your writing projects. I know I did. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.